The first thing Nelda Vale noticed was not the betrayal. It was the silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the hushed reverence that settles over a great hall before ceremony, the way sound pulls back like water retreating from shore. This was something else entirely. Something heavier. Something that had been building for months in corridors she had walked every day, without realizing the walls themselves were holding their breath. Blackthorn's ceremonial hall could hold 500 wolves. Tonight it held more than that, and every single one of them was staring at the floor. Warriors she had negotiated beside during the Ashfield Treaty talks. Elders who had accepted her counsel quietly, sometimes before they accepted Alexandra's. Pack mothers who had brought her dried herbs when the winter colds came and pressed her hands between theirs like she was their own daughter. They lined the hall now beneath the silver chandeliers and the carved moonstone pillars, shoulder to shoulder from the great doors all the way to the Alpha platform. And not one of them would look at her face. Nelda stood at the center of the hall alone. She wore the pale blue lunar gown she had been sent to dress in that morning by a servant who would not meet her eyes. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders the way Alexandra had always preferred it. Her hands were folded carefully at her waist. Her breathing was measured, slow, deliberate, because if she let it become anything else, she would not be able to stop. From the outside, she supposed, she still looked like a lunar. From the inside, something deep in her chest had already begun to understand. Across the hall, standing on the raised Alpha platform beneath the great carved wolf crest of Blackthorn, was Alexandra Vale, her mate, her Alpha, the man who had once ridden 3 territories through a winter storm because she had sent a single letter saying she was ill, who had stood before the moon altar at 19 and said her name like it was the most important word in any language he would ever speak, who had looked at her then, in the early years, like she was both the question and the answer. He was not looking at her like that now. He stood tall in his dark ceremonial armor, jaw set, amber eyes steady and deliberately blank, the way he looked when he had already made a decision and needed the room to understand that discussion was not an option. Beside him stood Karen Hardy, beautiful, composed, sharp in the way a polished blade is sharp. Karen wore deep crimson silk and rested one hand against Alexandra's arm with the ease of someone who had already decided she belonged there. Her pale eyes moved across the hall with a calm satisfaction that turned Nelda's stomach cold. In Blackthorn, Omegas did not rule. That was the written truth of the kingdom. They soothed. They stabilized. They held the emotional architecture of the pack together quietly, while the Alpha held the political structure visibly. A Luna's power was never announced. It was simply felt the way warmth is felt in a room long after the fire has been built. Nelda had done far more than that. For 6 years, she had managed the northern trade alliances that fed Blackthorn through 2 famine winters. She had negotiated the Ashvale border peace that kept 3 rival packs from open war. She had rebuilt the supply routes after the river flooding and personally corresponded with 4 council territories when Alexandra was recovering from the injury that nearly cost him his title. The council respected her quietly. The warriors trusted her completely. And somewhere in the space between all of that, Alexandra had grown tired of standing beside a woman who made him work to keep up. Karen never made him work. That, Nelda now understood, had always been the problem. Nelda, Alexandra's voice was even. He descended 1 step from the platform, not toward her, simply positioning himself with the practiced authority of a man who had staged this moment carefully. This council was called to remove any confusion about the future of this pack's leadership. She heard the words. She felt them land in her chest like stones, dropped into still water, rippling outward through every assumption she had made about her life. Not grief, not even an apology. Procedure. You are no longer my chosen mate, he said. Karen will stand as Luna from this night forward. The words moved through the hall like a blade drawn slowly across stone. Long, deliberate. Still no one spoke. Not one elder rose. Not one warrior stepped forward. Not one voice in 500 wolves offered a single sound of protest. They had all known. Nelda looked slowly around the room and understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its completeness, that everyone here had watched this coming, had seen Alexandra drift, had watched Nelda slowly disappear from her own life, one quiet absence at a time, and none of them had come to her. Not once. Not with a warning. Something inside her did not shatter. It hardened. She reached up and unclasped the moonstone pendant at her throat, the lunar seal of Blackthorn, and walked forward 3 steps. She placed it at the foot of the throne, without a word. A visible tremor passed through the room. In Blackthorn tradition, A Luna surrendering her seal willingly was a declaration that the bond itself was beyond repair. It could not be undone by political decree. It could only be answered. Alexandra's jaw tightened. Nelda. Don't. She looked at him fully for the first time all evening. You already did. She turned and walked out of the great hall alone. The massive doors swallowed the silence behind her. The freezing night air struck her skin like a wound, and she shifted before she had even finished the first step into the snow, her wolf small and silver white beneath the moonlight, running north because north was the only direction that felt like it belonged to no one. She ran until her paws bled against frozen stone. She ran until the ache in her chest became the only sound left in the world. And then she collapsed beside a frozen river under black pines, in a ruined gown in the dark, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she stopped pretending she was fine. That was when she heard him. No sound, no warning. Simply a presence, vast and still, crouching several feet away in the shadow of the tree line, watching her with eyes black as deep water. She had heard his name whispered around fires the way people whisper about things they fear and cannot explain. Claude Laurent, the monster of the north. She lifted her face from the snow and looked directly at him. He did not move. Are you here to tell me to go home? She whispered. A long silence, then quietly, no, just that. One word. But something in the way he said it made the last wall inside her chest begin, very slowly, to crack. He did not ask her name that night. He did not ask her anything. He simply stood when she stopped trembling long enough to shift back, and he shrugged his heavy fur-lined cloak from his shoulders and held it out toward her without a word, without looking directly at her, the way you might offer something to a wounded animal you did not want to startle. Nelda took it. That was how it began. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. The journey to Ironfang territory took most of the night. Claude moved through the frozen forest ahead of her in his wolf form, massive and black as a gap between stars, and she followed because there was nowhere else to go, and because something about his silence felt less like indifference and more like a deliberate kind of patience. He never moved faster than she could manage. He never looked back to check on her the way people look back when they want you to notice they are being kind. He simply kept pace with her. And somehow that was worse than pity would have been, because she did not know what to do with it. She had heard stories about Claude Laurent since she was a girl. Every pack in the Northern Territories had. He was the kind of name mothers used to quiet frightened children during the border raids, not cruelly, but because his name alone carried the weight of something that lived beyond ordinary danger. They said he had fought 30 rogue wolves alone during the Thornwall collapse, and walked out of the burning wreckage carrying 2 of his own men over his shoulders. They said his wolf was so large that lesser bloodlines submitted on instinct when he entered a room, not by command, just by presence, the way the body understands thunder before the mind does. They said he had never bowed to anyone in his life, not kings, not councils, not the moon itself. Ironfang territory sat at the edge of the northern ridge, carved into the mountainside like it had been built by someone who wanted the land itself to serve as a warning. The fortress was black granite and old timber, functional and severe, without the decorative moonstone and silver filigree of blackthorn. No banners, no ceremony, just walls built to hold and gates built to keep the world out. Nelda had expected cold. What she had not expected was quiet order. The wolves who served here moved with precision and without waste. They acknowledged Claude with nods rather than performances. Nobody scrambled. Nobody performed deference for the sake of it. And when Claude brought her through the inner gates just before dawn, a warrior twice her size took one look at his expression and simply stepped aside. No questions, no inspection. She was given a room with a heavy door and a window that faced the pine forest, and a fire that had already been built before she arrived. She did not ask how. She was too exhausted to ask anything. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, there was tea outside her door, still warm, no knock, no note. Just tea, sitting on the stone floor, as though it had always been there, as though someone had timed it carefully, and then walked away before she could feel the weight of being cared for. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, holding the cup in both hands. Then she went back inside and drank it without crying, which felt like an achievement. She spent her first week at Ironfang, learning the shape of the place the way you learn a language by listening before speaking. The warriors here were afraid of Claude, in the particular way that people are afraid of something they also deeply respect. Not flinching fear, but the careful attention of men who understood they were standing near something that operated by different rules than everything else. They gave him room. They measured their words. The children did not. She saw it on the third morning. A girl of perhaps 6 years, the daughter of one of the senior patrol captains, marched directly up to Claude in the main courtyard while he was reviewing reports with 2 of his commanders, tugged the edge of his black cloak without hesitation, and held up a drawing she had made of his wolf form, enormous and lopsided and grinning in a way wolves do not actually grin. Claude looked down at the drawing for a long moment. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat. The 2 commanders found somewhere else to look. Nelda, watching from the upper corridor, felt something shift quietly in her chest. Nobody asked her about Blackthorn. Claude had made something clear without saying it. She could feel the shape of it in every interaction, in the way conversation adjusted when she entered a room, in the absence of pointed looks and careful questions. Whatever she was before she arrived here was her own to carry or put down as she chose. She was not sure she deserved that. On the 6th day, she wandered into the strategy room looking for something to read and found a set of Ironfang border maps spread across the central table. She looked at them for 5 minutes before she realized her hands were already moving, adjusting patrol markers, correcting a supply route that curved 20 miles past the most efficient passage through the eastern ridge. She stopped when she heard the doorway. Claude stood there watching her, not with surprise, with the quiet expression of someone whose suspicion had just been confirmed. She pulled her hands back. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. You rerouted the eastern supply line," he said. "The current route adds 2 days in winter conditions. There's a ridge past that." She stopped. "I apologize. It isn't my territory." He looked at the map for a moment, then at her. "I have 6 border routes that need reviewing before the cold season closes the mountain passes," he said. "The last man I trusted with them missed 4 strategic weaknesses." Silence. "I'm asking," he added quietly. Nelda looked at the maps, at the careful restrictions her hands had made without her permission, at the territory that was not hers and the work that felt, unexpectedly, like breathing. She hesitated, then said, "Show me the others." The eastern supply route was only the beginning. Within 3 days of reviewing the border maps, Nelda had identified 2 patrol blind spots in the northern ridge, a 4-hour gap in the overnight watch rotation that left the timber road completely unmonitored, and a trade route through the Ashfan Pass that was costing Ironfang 11 days of travel time every supply cycle because whoever originally charted it had prioritized avoiding elevation rather than avoiding weather. She presented her findings carefully, methodically, the way she had learned to present things to councils that would be looking for reasons to dismiss her. Organized, evidenced, unemotional. Claude read through everything without interrupting. Then he handed it to his patrol commander and said, "Implement it. No committee, no deliberation. No 3-day period of consideration while men who had done less work decided whether to trust her conclusions. Just implement it." Nelda walked back to her room afterward and stood at the window for a long time, looking at the pine forest, trying to identify the feeling sitting in her chest. It took her a while to recognize it. It was the absence of exhaustion. She started sleeping properly around the 2nd week, not all at once. First it was 5 hours instead of 3, then 6. Then one morning she woke to pale winter light slanting across the stone floor and realized she had slept through the night completely, without once lying awake, cataloging every moment she should have seen coming. She started eating around the 3rd week. This was partly Claude's doing, though he would never have framed it that way. He did not comment on the meals she skipped. He did not send servants to check on her or arrange concerned interventions. He simply had the kitchen begin leaving food in the strategy room during the late evening hours when she worked. And if she worked past the 3rd hour and the food remained untouched, the next night's portions were smaller and easier to eat without thinking about it. Dried fruit and soft bread and warm broth that didn't require a decision so much as an automatic motion of the hand. She noticed. She said nothing, neither did he, but she started eating. The late-night map sessions became the rhythm of her days. There was something about the hours after the fortress settled into quiet, when her mind worked most clearly, when the political noise of the world fell away, and left only the clean logic of geography and movement and supply. Claude kept similar hours, or perhaps he simply adjusted his to match hers without announcing it. Most nights she would arrive in the strategy room to find him already there, reading correspondence by firelight, and he would move his papers to one side without comment to make room for her maps. They did not talk much at first. They did not need to. But slowly, over the course of many nights and many fires burning low, conversation began happening the way Thor happens. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, irreversible increments. He told her about the border wars in the flat, careful tone of someone who had processed the worst of it long ago, and now carried it as geography rather than wound. She told him about the northern trade negotiations, the particular difficulty of convincing 3 rival pack councils to agree on tariff terms when each believed the other 2 were cheating, and how she had solved it by restructuring the agreement so each pack's advantage was visible to them individually rather than collectively. Claude had been quiet for a moment after that. "That's not diplomacy," he said. "That's architecture," she had laughed. It surprised them both. A small, genuine laugh, unprepared and unguarded. And it sat in the room for a moment, like something fragile and unexpectedly warm before she looked back at the maps, and Claude looked back at his correspondence, and neither of them remarked on it. But she noticed that he did not try to fill the silence afterward. He simply let it be what it was. That was the part that frightened Leighton, because she could feel it happening. The slow, dangerous loosening of the careful distance she had maintained since Blackthorn. She could feel herself beginning to rely on the steadiness of this place, and the quiet attention of the man who ran it. And every time she felt that loosening, she heard something cold and sensible in the back of her mind say, "You know how this ends." She had made herself indispensable once before. She had been valued once before, and in the end, being useful had not protected her from anything. It had simply made the silence in Blackthorn's great hall more humiliating, because everyone there had benefited from her competence, and not one of them had considered it a reason to stand beside her when it mattered. What would be different this time? She did not know the answer, and not knowing frightened her more than the question. Back in Blackthorn, the fractures were widening. She learned this in pieces, through Iron Fang's scouts, who gathered information the way all northern packs did, carefully and constantly. 3 trade alliances had gone quiet since her departure. The council had fractured over the winter provisions. Border raids from the eastern rogue groups had increased, and without the diplomatic architecture Nelda had spent years building, Blackthorn had no framework to respond to them through anything except force. Alexandra was using force, it was not working. Karen, the scouts said, pushed him harder when he doubted himself rather than steadying him. The council had begun holding sessions without inviting him. Nelda absorbed this information and felt nothing that surprised her. It was a Thursday evening when Claude came to stand beside her over the completed route maps, the full 6-territory network she had spent 3 weeks restructuring, and looked at them in silence for a long moment. Then he said, simply and without performance, "You see patterns other people miss." Nelda looked at the maps, at the work her hands had made, at the proof, quietly spread across the table, that she had never actually stopped being who she was. She had only stopped being seen. For the first time in months, those were not the same thing. The council dispute began over grain allocation and ended with something else entirely. Iron Fang's senior advisors had gathered to review winter resource distribution, a routine meeting Nelda had attended twice before without incident. But Councillor Drav, the oldest of Claude's territorial advisors, and the one most visibly uncomfortable with her continued presence, had waited until Claude was occupied with a border report before turning to address her directly. "With respect," he said, in the tone people use when they mean none, "the supply restructuring created dependencies on 3 external trade partners we cannot fully verify. That risk was introduced by someone with no formal standing in this territory." The room went careful and still. Nelda kept her expression neutral. She had sat across from men like Drav her entire adult life, men who recognized competence in others as a personal inconvenience, and she had learned that the worst thing you could do was let them see the moment the words found their target. She was already composing her measured response when Claude set down the border report. "The restructuring reduced our winter shortfall by 30%, he said, without raising his voice. "The verification framework for the trade partners was Nelda's design. I reviewed it. If you have a specific concern about the risk assessment, bring documentation to the next session." He looked back at the report. "We're finished with this topic." Drav did not speak again for the remainder of the meeting. Nelda said nothing about it afterward, neither did Claude. But that evening, when she arrived in the strategy room, she sat down without the particular tension she had carried in her shoulders since Blackthorn. The braced quality of a person perpetually waiting to be reminded they were tolerated rather than wanted. It did not occur to her until later, that this was the first time someone had defended her without being asked. She found him 3 nights later sitting alone in the small armory adjacent to his quarters, his shirt pulled back from his left shoulder, jaw set in the expression of a man working through pain by pretending it did not exist. The old injury was visible as a ridge of scar tissue running from his shoulder blade to the base of his neck, deep and badly healed, the kind of wound that knits itself together without proper treatment because the person receiving it could not afford to stop. "Sit still," she said, instead of asking permission. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat still. She had learned wound care the same way she had learned everything useful, quietly, because someone needed to know it, and she was present and willing. Her hands were steady as she worked the stiffened tissue with the salve she had found in Iron Fang's medical stores, and Claude was silent, except for the slight change in his breathing when she found the worst of it. "Border wars," he said eventually, not a question. "I know," she said. "Your patrol commander mentioned Thornwall." A long pause. "My mother was from the Valley settlement there," he said. "My father ran one of the outer patrol units. When the collapse came," he stopped, started again. "I was 17. I got out. They didn't." Nelda's hands kept moving. She did not offer condolences, because she understood instinctively that he was not telling her this to receive them. He was telling her because the room was quiet and the fire was low, and they had reached, without planning it, the particular territory of trust where true things become possible to say. "I stayed in Blackthorn 2 years longer than I should have," she said quietly, "after I knew. After I could feel him pulling away, and I understood what it meant." She smoothed salve over the last of the scar. "I kept thinking if I did enough, managed enough, held enough together, he would remember why he chose me. Did it work? You know it didn't." "I know," he said. "I wanted you to say it." She understood why. There was a difference between knowing a thing and releasing it into the air between 2 people, making it real, making it something that could finally be set down. She set it down. Word from Blackthorn came through the trade network rather than official channels, which meant it was worse than Alexandra wanted publicly known. 3 Eastern alliances had withdrawn cooperation entirely. The winter provisions were short, and the border raids, which Nelda had spent 2 years managing through diplomatic frameworks, had increased to nearly weekly incursions. What interested Claude's intelligence contacts most, however, was a pattern in the raid timing. The attacks had intensified sharply in the 7 months since Karen Hardy's arrival at Blackthorn, always targeting the supply routes Nelda had originally established, always with unusual knowledge of patrol schedules. Claude mentioned this to Nelda without framing it as a conclusion. She looked at the dates on the intelligence report for a long moment. "That's not coincidence," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. The snowstorm came in fast from the northern ridge that night, the kind that seals every window and turns the world outside into a white erasure. They stayed in the strategy room long after the maps had been rolled away, sitting close to the fire because the room's stone walls held cold the way stone does, deeply and for hours. The conversation had drifted, as it sometimes did now, away from logistics and into quieter things. He told her something that had made him laugh as a boy. She told him about the first alliance negotiation she had conducted entirely alone, nervous and overprepared, and somehow successful anyway. At some point the fire burned low. She did not get up to add wood, he did not either. Their hands rested on the same armrest between the 2 chairs, and at some point, without announcement or decision, the side of his hand settled against the side of hers. Neither of them moved. Outside the snow continued its steady erasure of the world, and inside the fire made its small, patient sounds, and neither of them pulled away. Coldmere Fortress sat at the convergence of 3 northern territories like a fist pressed into the mountain, built during the border wars by packs who needed neutral ground and trusted no one enough to meet anywhere else. It was all dark stone and iron gates and corridors that amplified footsteps into something resembling a verdict. Nelda had been here twice before, both times beside Alexandra, both times in lunar silver. She arrived this time in black. Claude had said nothing about what she wore. He had simply noted, 3 days before departure, that she would be attending the summit as Iron Fang's chief strategist, not as a guest, not as an observer, and that her findings on the rogue attack patterns would be presented to all 5-pack councils jointly. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, as a fact rather than a favor. She had stood in front of the mirror that morning for a long time, her hands moving once toward the pale colors she had worn for 6 years before stopping. Then she had dressed in black and walked out without looking back. The effect was not subtle. They entered the great hall of Coldmere behind the Iron Fang honor guard, and Nelda felt the shift in the room the way you feel weather change before it arrives. A pressure adjustment, a collective recalibration. Heads turned. Recognition moved through the assembled wolves in a visible wave, because most of the people in this room had negotiated with her at some point, had sat across treaty tables from her, had accepted agreements she had constructed, and they were now processing the considerable distance between who they expected to see and who had actually walked through the door. She kept her gaze forward and her hands still. Beside her, Claude moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once considered that a room might not accommodate him. She felt the Iron Fang wolves' close ranks slightly around her as they moved toward their designated council position, not aggressively, simply as a natural adjustment of space, the way a unit positions around something it considers worth protecting. She noticed it because she had spent 6 years noticing the small physical language of pack dynamics. She had never been on this side of it before. She did not let herself feel that yet. There were too many things in this room that required her full attention. Alexandra was one of them. He stood with the Blackthorn contingent on the western side of the hall, and she knew the precise moment he saw her because she had spent enough years reading his stillness to recognize when it changed quality. He went very quiet in a particular way. His amber eyes moved from her face to her clothing, to the position she occupied within the Iron Fang formation, and she watched him work through the arithmetic of what he was seeing. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took to confirm he had seen her. Then she looked away and did not look back. The summit opened with the standard territorial grievances, border disputes, resource strain, the accumulated friction of 5 packs trying to survive the same difficult winter through competing self-interest. Nelda let the first 2 hours pass without speaking, listening, cataloguing, building the complete map in her mind. When Claude nodded to her, she stood. She presented her findings without preamble. The rogue attack patterns, charted across 18 months of border incidents from all 5 territories. The timing anomalies, the geographic precision that indicated inside knowledge of patrol schedules, the specific targeting of supply infrastructure that had, in every case, been established or managed by lunar-level administrators. The room was very quiet by the time she reached the final pattern. These attacks are not opportunistic, she said. They are architectural. Someone identified the structural support systems of each pack and removed them deliberately. In 3 of the 5 territories represented here, those support systems were undermined in the 6-month period immediately preceding the lunar destabilization events in those same territories. A Greymore elder leaned forward. "You're describing a coordinated campaign. I'm describing what the data describes," Nelda said. "The interpretation is yours." It was then that Claude's intelligence contact, a quiet wolf named Sevin, who had been sitting unannounced near the back of the hall, placed a sealed document on the council table. The intelligence was anonymous in origin but precise in content. Karen Hardy had not arrived at Blackthorn by accident. She had been placed. Her entry through the Southern Merchant Road was funded and coordinated by the same rogue network responsible for the border raids. The strategy had been elegant in its cruelty. Identify packs with strong lunar administrators, introduce emotional destabilization through the Alpha bond, remove the administrator, and watch the structural collapse follow naturally. Blackthorn had been the primary target because Blackthorn had the strongest lunar. The silence in the hall was different from any silence Nelda had sat inside before. She felt rather than saw Alexandra's reaction, the particular quality of a man understanding something too large and too late. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She found him anyway, afterward in the corridor outside the Eastern Council chamber. He had clearly been waiting. He looked like a man who had not slept in several weeks. The political confidence she had watched him carry for years had developed a visible crack somewhere through its center. "Nelda," he said. She stopped. She waited. "I didn't know about Karen, about any of it." "I know you didn't," she said, "because she did." Alexandra's failures had always been failures of attention rather than malice, which was its own particular kind of damage. He looked at her for a long moment. "Is there anything left of the Eastern alliances? Anything that can be? I'll send you the restoration framework," she said quietly. "It's already written." His expression moved through something she didn't have a name for anymore. She walked back to the Iron Fang section of the hall without waiting for his response. Claude was standing at the window, overlooking the mountain ridge when she found him. She told him what she intended to do. The restoration documents, the alliance framework, the information Blackthorn would need to survive the coming months. He listened without interrupting. "You owe them nothing. he said when she finished. Accept what your conscience allows. Nelda looked out at the snow-covered ridge. I know, she said. My conscience is why I'm doing it. He nodded once. That was enough. The second day of the summit began differently from the first. Word travels fast inside fortress walls, faster still among wolves, and by the time the five-pack councils reassembled in Coldmere's great hall that morning, the nature of what Nelda had presented the evening before had already moved through every corridor and anteroom in the building. She could feel it in the way the room arranged itself, subtle shifts in posture, the quality of attention directed toward the Iron Fang Council position, the particular stillness of people who have revised an opinion overnight and are now deciding whether to admit it. She had prepared for resistance. She received something else. The Greymore Alpha spoke first, which mattered because Greymore had not agreed with Iron Fang on anything diplomatically for 11 years. He unrolled a territorial map across the Central Council table and pointed to 3 locations along his east border that matched precisely the attack pattern Nelda had charted the night before. Here, he said, here and here. We lost 6 patrol wolves in the 3rd location during the last moon cycle. We attributed it to rogue opportunism. He looked at her. It wasn't, was it? No, Nelda said. It was reconnaissance. They were mapping your response time. Which means they're not finished. They're waiting for the supply routes to weaken further before the next phase. If we give them another 4 to 6 weeks, they won't need to breach your walls. You'll open them yourself looking for provisions. The room absorbed this. Then the Ashvan Alpha leaned forward. What do we do? It was not directed at Claude. It was not directed at the eldest council member or the most decorated warrior in the room. It was directed at her. Nelda had spent 6 years learning how to make herself useful in rooms where her authority was unofficial, operating through suggestion and careful framing, and the diplomatic art of letting powerful men believe they had arrived at her conclusions independently. She had become very good at it. She had also, somewhere along the way, mistaken the skill for the only way. She looked around the table at 5 alphas waiting for her to speak. She spoke. She presented the rogue staging points first, identified through the intersection of attack timing, geographic access routes, and the supply infrastructure damage patterns across all 5 territories. She had calculated 3 probable forward positions during the night, using Iron Fang's territorial maps cross-referenced with a border incident, reports the other packs had been willing to share. She was precise. She was direct. She did not soften the implications to make them easier to hear. The coordinated defense plan came together over 3 hours of discussion that she largely structured and occasionally redirected, not by asserting authority, but by asking the right questions in the right sequence, until the alphas arrived at the architecture she had already built in her mind. By the time the final patrol coordination was agreed upon, 4 of the 5-pack councils had voluntarily committed resources to a shared defensive network that, as recently as the previous morning, 3 of them would have refused on territorial principle. The Ashvan Alpha said, at the close of the session, that it was the most productive summit he had attended in 20 years. He said it looking at Nelda. Claude did not say anything to her about it directly. He didn't need to. She had learned to read his particular register of silence, the difference between the silence that meant he was processing and the silence that meant something had settled inside him as a clear and quiet fact. This was the second kind. He watched her work through the afternoon session with an expression she had not seen him wear before, not the careful observation of someone assessing a useful asset, not pride, which would have implied ownership, admiration, clean and uncomplicated and entirely without agenda. She caught it once, briefly, across the council table during a contested moment when the Blackthorn contingent was pushing back on the shared patrol commitments. She held it for 1 second, then looked back at the map, but something about it stayed with her in the specific way that true things do. Alexandra saw it too. She knew this because she understood, after 9 years of knowing him, exactly what his jaw looked like when he was absorbing a pain he had not anticipated. He watched Claude look at her, and he understood clearly and finally the specific quality of what he was seeing. A man valuing someone correctly, completely, without reservation. He had never looked at Nelda that way. He had never thought to. The ramparts of Coldmere caught the wind off the northern ridge and threw it back harder, and Nelda's breath clouded in the frozen air as she stood looking out at the snow-covered valley below. The fortress lights reflected pale gold across the white expanse. Somewhere behind her, the last summit fires were burning low. She heard Claude's footsteps before he reached her, unhurried on the stone walkway, And then he was standing beside her with enough space between them that it was a choice rather than a proximity. "You were remarkable today," he said. "I was doing my job," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "That's what was remarkable." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pine forest far below, a sound like distant breathing. "I don't know who I'm becoming anymore," she said. It came out more plainly than she intended, more honest. The kind of admission the cold and the dark make easier. "I spent so long being one thing in one place, and now she stopped. I don't have a word for it." Claude was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was choosing carefully. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the valley, giving her the privacy of his profile. And she understood that this too was deliberate, that he was offering the words without the weight of being watched receiving them. Her hand found his on the stone railing, without a decision being made. His fingers closed around hers quietly. They stood there together while the wind moved through the pines, and the snow held the light, and the valley stretched out below them vast and cold and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that felt like the future rather than the aftermath. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them let go. The attack came before the wolves of Coldmere had finished their last watch rotation. Nelda woke to the sound she had been dreading since she first mapped the rogue staging points 3 days earlier. Not an alarm, not a horn, but the specific quality of silence that descends when sentries stop moving. She was dressed and at the strategy room door before the first distant howl broke the dark open. She did not panic. She counted. The eastern gate had already been breached by the time she reached the war room. Seven was there ahead of her, his face tight, a scout's report in his hand that confirmed what she had feared since the staging point analysis. They had not waited for the supply routes to weaken. Something had changed their timeline. "How many?" she said. "First count puts it at 400, coming from the northeast ridge and the timber road simultaneously. 2 front assault." They had known the fortress layout. Of course they had. "Wake the Greymore contingent and put them on the northern wall," she said. "Ashvan covers the eastern corridor. Blackthorn and Ironfang hold the main gate." She was already moving to the tactical map. "The inner courtyard cannot fall. If they push us to the inner courtyard, we lose the wounded, and we lose the summit entirely." "You're coordinating defense?" Seven asked. "Unless someone else has a better map in their head," she said. "Go." He went. The Great Hall became a command post in minutes. Pack leaders arrived in stages, some half-armored, some shifting between forms as they moved, and Nelda directed each contingent to position with the flat efficiency of someone who had been building this exact architecture in her mind since the summit began. She did not ask, she did not suggest. She assigned, and the authority in her voice was not borrowed from anyone's title. It was simply hers. Claude found her at the center of it. He was already in his war armor, dark and fully assembled, and he moved through the chaos of the hall toward her without urgency, which meant he had already assessed the situation and chosen his position. He stopped beside her at the map table. "Northeast Ridge is the primary push," she said without looking up. "They want the gates opened from inside. There will be wolves in the outer wall passage already. I'll take the front line at the main gate." She looked at him then. The firelight caught the planes of his face, steady and without performance, and she had the sudden clear understanding that this was who he had always been beneath the reputation, not a monster, not a weapon. Simply a man who knew exactly what he was willing to stand in front of. "Don't be a hero," she said. Something shifted very briefly at the corner of his mouth. "Coordinate well," he said. Then he was gone into the dark. The battle came apart the way battles do, not cleanly, not according to any architecture, but in cascading moments of chaos that required constant recalibration. Nelda worked from the inner wall, relaying position updates between contingents, rerouting wolves from quiet sectors to collapsing ones, identifying the pressure points in the rogue assault as they emerged, and directing response before the breach could widen. It was the most clearly she had ever thought in her life. Alexandra found her on the eastern corridor wall when the second wave hit the outer gate, and for 20 minutes they fought side by side the way they had trained together years ago, before everything, when she had still believed that the shape of their future was the shape she had imagined. He fought hard, he always had. He was a strong alpha and a capable warrior, and he threw himself into the fight with everything he had. But she noticed, even through the chaos, even with 400 wolves pressing the walls of Coldmere, that he fought forward, always forward. His instinct was to push into danger, to dominate, to overwhelm. The wolves beside him followed because he was powerful, not because he made them feel safe. She had seen Claude fight before dawn took hold. Claude fought differently. He held the front line at the main gate for over an hour, and she could track his position by the way the Iron Fang wolves around him moved, not behind him, beside him. The defensive formation holding with a cohesion that came from men who trusted that the wolf next to them would not be abandoned. She watched him pull a younger Greymoor soldier back from a flanking blow he hadn't seen, absorbing the redirect himself, and keep fighting without breaking stride. She turned back to her sector. She did not see it happen. She heard it. A sound that was not quite a sound, more a shift in the particular noise of combat near the main gate, a change in its rhythm, and she turned to find the front line reforming raggedly around a gap where Claude had been standing. She was moving before she understood why. He was on one knee in the snow when she reached him, one hand braced against the ground, the other pressed to his side where the blow had landed. The younger wolf he had shielded stood unhurt 2 feet away, looking at Claude with an expression Nelda recognized from the inside. The wound was deep. She dropped beside him, and her hands moved on instinct, finding the damage, calculating what she had to work with, doing the thing her hands always did when she needed the rest of her to be somewhere else for a moment. And in that moment, with the battle still screaming around them, and the snow coming down in slow, indifferent curtains, and Claude's breathing measured and careful in the deliberate way of a man managing pain with everything he has, she understood, not the soft unfolding that had been building for months. This was harder and clearer and entirely without ambiguity. The kind of knowing that arrives when the thing you feared losing is suddenly close enough to lose. She loved him, not because the moon had written it, not because the bond had demanded it, because he had chosen her, quietly and consistently, in every small irreversible way that actually mattered, and she had not understood until this moment what it felt like to want to choose someone back with the whole unguarded weight of herself. "I have you," she said. Claude looked at her through the snow. "I know," he said. Then his hand found the ground and he went still. He did not die. She had known this was possible from the moment she assessed the wound. The blade had gone deep, but missed the vital structures by a margin that felt, in the days that followed, less like luck, and more like an argument she intended to have with him when he was well enough to withstand it. The fortress healers closed the wound before dawn. The battle ended at sunrise. Claude was unconscious through both. Nelda did not leave his side. She had not made a decision about this. It was simply what her body did, stationed itself beside him with the same quiet certainty it brought to everything she had stopped pretending was optional. The Iron Fang healers understood without being told. They worked around her, kept the fire, changed the dressings, and left the medicine on the table within her reach because it was clear she would be administering it regardless. She fed it to him in small doses through the first day, when he was in and out of consciousness and largely uncooperative in the distracted way of someone too injured to sustain an argument. He submitted to the medicine with poor grace and no complaint, which she had come to understand was simply how he experienced everything he could not control. On the second night he was awake enough to be still deliberately, rather than helplessly. "You should sleep," he said. "I slept this afternoon. For an hour. You were counting. I was conscious for parts of it." She looked at him. He looked back at her from the pillow with the particular expression he wore when he was being patient about something he intended to return to. She had catalogued this expression over months of late-night map sessions and was not intimidated by it. She handed him the medicine. He took it without further argument. He was vulnerable in a way she had not seen before, and what moved her most was that he did not perform strength over the top of it. He did not make jokes to redirect her concern or manufacture composure to protect his dignity. He was simply present in his diminished state, quiet and watchful and real, and she understood that this was the last wall, the one she had not known existed until it came down, and what lay behind it was nothing frightening. Just a man, lonely for a long time, unaccustomed to being looked after and uncertain what to do with it. She knew the feeling exactly. On the third night, in the low firelight with the fortress settled into its late silence around them, he said, "I thought about you during the fighting." Before he stopped, "I know." She said, "I don't do that," he said. "Think about someone in the middle of something that requires my full attention." "I know that too." He looked at the fire for a moment. "I wasn't sure what to do with it." Nelda set down the cloth she had been folding and looked at him directly. "I was terrified," she said. "When you went down, I want you to know that. I wasn't frightened the way you're frightened for someone you care about. I was terrified the way you're terrified of losing something that has become essential." She paused. I needed you to know the difference." Claude was quiet for a long moment. "I know the difference," he said softly. Outside, the snow continued its patient accumulation against the fortress walls. Inside, the fire made its small sounds. Neither of them needed to say anything else. Alexandra came to the door of the recovery room once, on the 4th day. He stood in the corridor for a moment, visible through the gap, and Nelda saw him see it, the complete and unremarkable picture of her there. The medicine on the table, the chair pulled close, the ease of a woman in a space she had made her own through simple, consistent presence. He saw Claude's eyes find her from the bed without searching, the instinctive orientation of someone who has learned where warmth is located in a room. Alexandra stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then he walked away. She understood what he had understood. Not the dramatic revelation of the summit intelligence, not the political collapse, not the rogue conspiracy. All of that was external, comprehensible, something a man could point to and say this is where it went wrong. This was different. This was the quiet recognition of something that could not be argued with, or reframed or explained away. Nelda had not left because she stopped loving him. She had loved him for years past the point of wisdom, stayed past the point of dignity, given more than the relationship had ever given her in return. She had stopped loving him because he had never once looked at her the way the man in that bed looked at her now. He had simply never noticed. The final alliance gathering assembled 10 days after the battle. In Coldmere's Great Hall, with the summit councils reconvened and the rogue network fractured and its staging points dismantled by the coordinated defense Nelda had built in a war room before dawn. The formal recognition took place before all 5 packs. The Greymore Alpha spoke first, then Ashvin. The acknowledgements were political in structure and genuine in tone, the specific combination that meant they had been discussed in advance by people who wanted them to mean something. Nelda stood and received them with the composure of a woman who had learned that being seen correctly required no performance. Then the room shifted. Claude rose from the Iron Fang Council position and crossed the hall. He moved without urgency, without theatre, in the same unhurried way he moved through every space he inhabited, and the room went very quiet in the particular way rooms do when something is happening that everyone present understands they will remember. He stopped before her, and the most feared wolf in the Northern Territories bowed his head. Not the formal inclination of political acknowledgement, not the calculated gesture of alliance. Full, deliberate, personal. The bow of a man who saw someone completely and wanted the world to understand exactly what he was looking at. The silence in the hall was absolute. Nelda felt it move through her, not as surprise, but as arrival, the recognition of something that had been true for a long time finally standing in the light, where it could be properly seen. Across the hall, she was not watching, but she knew. Alexandra Vale finally understood the full and irreversible weight of what he had thrown away. Not a burden, not a challenge, not a woman who had loved him too quietly to notice, a foundation, and he had torn it out himself. The North took 3 weeks to settle. Not fully. The North never settled fully. It was not built for stillness. But the particular tension that had been tightening across the 5 territories for the better part of a year began, slowly and measurably, to release. The rogue network's command structure collapsed within days of the battle, its staging points dismantled by coordinated pack forces, moving on the precise intelligence Nelda had mapped before dawn in a fortress war room. What remained scattered into the deeper wilderness, leaderless and fractured, the kind of threat that time and vigilance could manage, rather than the kind that required another summit. Karen Hardy was taken into Blackthorn custody on the 11th day. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was architectural, the same word Claude had used about Nelda's diplomacy, and the symmetry was not lost on anyone who had been present at both moments. The financial records, the correspondence, the testimony of 3 rogue wolves who accepted reduced consequences in exchange for complete information. It was the kind of case that does not require argument because it requires only reading. Alexandra presented the findings to his own council. Nelda heard about it through the trade network, the same way she had heard about everything from Blackthorn for months, at a distance, in pieces, with the detachment of someone who had accepted that a place can stop being home without stopping being a place you once loved. The council had not received the findings quietly. 2 senior elders had resigned. The Eastern Alliance negotiations, which Nelda had outlined in the restoration framework she sent through Sevin, had resumed with cautious momentum. Blackthorn would survive. It would take time, and it would take work, and it would require Alexandra to become something more honest, than he had previously been willing to be. Whether he was capable of that was not her question to answer anymore. She had her own questions now, better ones. The formal offer came from Claude on a Tuesday morning, which felt deliberately ordinary, as though he had chosen the most unremarkable possible moment to say something that mattered enormously. He slid a document across the strategy room table while she was reviewing the spring patrol rotations. She looked at it, Iron Fang letterhead. Her name, followed by a formal title she had been functionally occupying for 2 months without the architecture to support it. Chief Strategist and Territorial Advisor. Permanent appointment, subject to her acceptance. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the careful steadiness of a man who had prepared for multiple comms and was not going to let his preference show until she had arrived at her own. This isn't a request born of utility, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said. Iron Fang functions better with you in it. That's true, but that's not why I'm asking. She looked at the document again, at her name in clean black ink on Iron Fang paper, not as a borrowed title, not as a courtesy extended through someone else's authority, but as a thing that was simply hers, offered without condition. Stay because you want to, he said quietly. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because it's practical, because you want to. Nelda was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. The response from Iron Fang was not ceremonial. It was immediate and entirely natural, which was the part that stayed with her longest afterward. The warriors did not adjust their behavior because she had been formally appointed. They adjusted nothing because there was nothing to adjust. She had been home here for months in every way that the word actually meant, in the small dailiness of it, in the children who ran to show her things they had found in the snow, in the patrol captains who sought her out before bringing problems to anyone else, in the kitchen staff who had learned her preferences without being asked and simply implemented them as a matter of course. She walked through the Iron Fang courtyard on the morning after signing the document and felt the difference between being tolerated in a place and belonging to one. It was not a feeling she had expected to find again. She had thought, in the worst of the early weeks at Blackthorn's frozen river, that she had exhausted her capacity for it, that the version of herself capable of belonging somewhere had been standing in that ceremonial hall in pale blue silk and had not walked back out through those doors. She had been wrong. That version of herself had simply been waiting for a place worthy of her. Claude smiled more now, not frequently, not performatively, but the expression that had previously appeared only in rare, unguarded moments, the quiet one, the one that reached his eyes and stayed there briefly like light through a gap in cloud cover, appeared with a regularity that his senior commanders had apparently begun quietly noting among themselves. She knew this because Sevin had mentioned it with the carefully neutral expression of a man reporting a development he considered significant. She had not mentioned it to Claude. She saved it instead, the way you save certain things, not for use, but simply for knowing. The moon was full on the last night of the month, the kind of full that turns snow into something luminous and fills the spaces between pine trees with a light that belongs to no single hour. Nelda stood on the outer rampart of Iron Fang, not the summit fortress, not someone else's neutral ground, but her own walls, her own ridge, her own dark sky overhead, and she felt the complete and quiet truth of where she was. Claude came to stand beside her. They had become comfortable with each other's silences, in the way that people become comfortable when the silences have stopped needing to protect anything. She turned to look at him in the moonlight and raised her hand to his face, her palm against his jaw, and felt him go very still the way he went still for things that mattered. You never asked me to become smaller for you, she said. He held her gaze without flinching. You were never meant to be, he said. She kissed him in the moonlight with the full, unhurried certainty of a woman who had finally stopped standing beside the wrong man. Below them, Iron Fang breathed its quiet nighttime breath. Wolves moved on patrol through the snow-covered tree line. Fires burned in the lower windows. Somewhere in the fortress a child laughed at something in the dark, and the moon held them both in its patient, indifferent light. Not because fate had written them toward each other. Not because a bond had demanded it. Because she had walked out of a great hall alone into the snow, and he had been there, and he had offered her silence and tea and a border map and the radical dignity of being seen completely, and she had chosen him back, freely, fully, without reservation. The moon did not make the most feared wolf bow before her. Love did. If this story moved you, subscribe for more emotional werewolf romance tales filled with powerful heroines, unforgettable alphas, and love that is always, always earned.